Hi crafters! I brought you in a little tight here for this video because I wanted to do some close-up work showing you how to create a beaded earring with some wood and crystal long beads here. We have just a little bit of some tiny 15-0 beads at the top for the little loop, and then an 11-0 seed bead using brick stitch around a component to make the base to make this beautiful earring. So we're just going to make the other earring, and I'm going to show you what I did. Now I do have a size 12 beading needle, which you may or may not have been able to see on that mat. It blended in pretty well. And I already have my line on there. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to bring that line through my circular component and bring that all the way down, and I'm actually just going to tie the thread onto the component. Now leave yourself a little bit of room here on the end so that you have enough to weave. And the amount of thread that I grabbed is a wingspan, so about 5 feet, and that is that seems to work out just nicely with not a whole lot left over. This beading thread is not inexpensive, so I don't like to waste it, but I also would hate to come up short and have to add thread at the end. It'd be so silly on such a small component. If you're making something bigger, then of course you would want to do that, but not for one earring. So I just did a overhand knot, and I'm just gonna on my second knot do a surgeon's knot, I think it's called, where you just wrap that twice instead of once and bring that down. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my tail thread out of the way. I'm going to hold my component in my fingers, and I'm actually going to close up around that circle a little bit, just enough so that my needle can get underneath it and work its way through, because I don't want the beads going through that circle. They're going to sit on top of everything. So the first thing I'm going to do is pick up 2 of my 11-0 seed beads. I'm going to bring these down. Now you don't need to carry them down. I'll show you in just a minute on the second one. You could bring it and seat it on top of your ring. You could also just bring, by covering up the hole there a little bit, bring your needle through the center of the ring, and that would have eventually fed those beads down as well. So when I get to the end here, I'm just going to pull them tight enough that they kind of go side by side, and then I'm going to take my needle and go back. So my string is coming from the ring through bead 1 and back down through bead 2, around the ring, and then I'm going to come up in the opposite direction just into that first bead. And bring that through and snug it up. Now you'll notice that your second bead's sitting pretty nicely on that ring, but the first one isn't. It's not going to. You could go down and back up that one and down. I just found that it didn't really do much for it. I have a better time when I just complete the ring and then connect the last 2. So we'll get to that. So you start by putting 2 beads on, you bring your thread through the ring, back up through that first bead. Now you're just going to repeat that motion with just 1 bead at a time until you go all the way around your ring. So we'll go ahead and make our first row. So now I've got 1 bead on here. I'm going to take that needle and bring it through, but watch, I'm going to use my fingers now to just pinch that, just so that the thread can go through, but the bead cannot. And that should bring that bead up right alongside that first one. And it's going to sit right on that ring. So my thread's coming from the other side, so I'm just going to come in here, whoops, grab that bead going in the opposite direction. So I'm at the end here of my first row, and I want to show you something. I've got my beads coming around here. And I've got a bead that's sort of sticking up at the beginning, and I kind of have the same thing happening here at the end, and it looks like a pretty good gap. It looks like you could fit a bead in there. But when you see these down the way they need to be, it actually fills that in really nicely. So forcing a bead in here will start to push them in different directions off of the ring. So you actually want to leave that alone and go ahead when you're, whoops, I've got it backwards, but basically the same thing. Let's turn that around here. I'm a lefty, by the way, in case you hadn't noticed. So now that I've got that last bead on here, I don't want to try and squeeze something in. I'm just going to come over from this bead here over to that first bead, put my string in there, whoops, there we go. It was up more sideways than I thought. I went from my first bead into my last bead into my first bead and down and back up again into that last bead. So the thread's coming out of the top. So I'm perfectly seated now to begin row number 2. So to begin the second row, I'm going to do the same thing I did on the first row. I'm going to pick up 2 beads and then move forward with 1 bead at a time. Now when you do the second row, you're not going into you're not going around that loop anymore. You're just going into the little bit of thread that's in between these 2 beads. So you're just going to take your needle in between the 2. Now you don't have to quite hold it so tight because those beads aren't going to go through that little gap. So you just bring those down, and it's going to do the same thing where it starts to seat them for you, side by side. Just come back up through the first bead only, and then you're off and running. Now, I would give you bead counts, and I'll tell you what my bead counts are here. I generally, and I want, once you make one, do count the beads and make sure it's the same. But I had 10 beads on the first row, 15 on the second, and 20 on the third. I've made another pair where it was 10, 14, and 19 though, so it really does change with the beads. So don't get too caught up just when you're making the second bead earring, or if you're making 2 matched, then be a little caught up in it. But when you're making your first one, don't worry about where it is. So pick up 1 bead and then just come in between. Now, that being said, where you might, now you're going to end up with 15 beads, is every once in a while you're going to have a bead that you pick up in that same string. And I'm not quite ready yet, but in this one I'm probably going to need, in this gap here, to put in 2, re-enter that gap twice. So I'm going to take my first bead and it'll end up right about here, and then I'll come back into here and it'll end up coming over and shifting a little bit. So if you don't do that, you can't just put 1 and 1 because you'll just end up with 10 and there'll be wide gaps in between. So here's my first one. And make sure you're sort of doing that when it starts to make sense, when you start to feel like it's kind of still, even when you've put a bead on, it's still kind of staying right above the one that it came over from. That's when you can go, okay, I can put 2 there. And again, just even tension, not too tight. Bring it up a second time into that same space. And then just continue on and go around until you've placed all your beads for the second row. And I'm just going to do this, speed it up again for you so you don't have to watch me go too slow. I'm at the end of row 2. I'm on my last bead, and I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to come down from the top of the first bead. I'm actually going to feed through 2 beads just to give it a little more strength and stability. And it seats up really nicely that way. And I don't need to go around my band at all. I'm just going to come in and find a way to get back up into that last bead again. Whoops. Which, if you can't do it all at once, you can always do it in a couple. There we go. So I've got it fed through those 2, and it's coming back out of the last bead. So we're ready now for the last row, number 3. Okay, so I don't know if you noticed, but on this last round, 19 is just as good as it's going to get. And I probably should double check this one. Maybe it's only 19. But 19 brings it right back where it needs to be. There's no possible way of fitting in another bead in there. So there's no way to force that. I just want to stop at 19. And I'm going to go ahead again and just get that last bead. I'm going to come down just through 2. Seat that nicely. And then just reach over and come up the 2 so I'm back in my beginning bead. Now, there's 2 things we're going to do here to match our first earring. One is we're going to just do a little accent bead on the end of each bead for all of them except the one that's going to go up. So I'm going to do that accent bead first. And that is with the 15s, which are just tiny. So what I'm going to do is, and it doesn't matter really where you stop and start, so since I already have my thread up, I'm just going to start here. And I'm going to pick up a seed bead, a little tiny 15, and then I'm just going to come right back down just through 1 bead. I found that going through just the top bead was fine. If you feel like you wanted to go through more of the beads for more stability and then come back up, you could just weave it down through a couple and then come over and weave it back up to the next bead. For me, I just didn't feel like that was necessary. So I'm just going to come out of the one and then up the one next to it and do the same thing. I'm just going to pick up 1 15 and come right back down. And go all the way around your circle until you get to the last remaining bead. And do not put a seed bead on that one. Okay, so we've gone all the way around. We have 2 unaccented beads left. I'm going to go into that second to the last bead, add 1 more 15, and come back down. And when I come down from this one, I'm going to go ahead and feed this down a little bit. Now, I don't have a good direct line down, and I want to come back up through these 3, so I'm coming out here. So I'm just going to come over 1 and down. Okay, so I've got my thread now seated at that last bead without the 15 accent on there. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to pick up one of my 6mm crystals. I'm going to pick up that wooden bead. Now make sure that those will seat in nicely. This bead had a little bit of extra stuff in the middle, so I kind of carved it out with a reamer, and this one didn't seem to need it, so it depends on what bead you're using, right? If they're glass beads, you probably won't have that issue. So I've got a 6mm, my wooden bead, another 6mm, and my 3mm. And then I'm going to take and just weave that on. Then I'm going to add 6 15s, and those 6 will form my loop. So I've got everything seated and lined up. I'm going to skip these first 6 beads and go back through my 3mm, 6mm wooden bead and 6mm. Bring it all the way back through. And then I'm just going to take a minute to go through my beads here, and I'm going to work that through a little bit again. Go in any direction you want, but situate yourself so you can come back up through your beads one more time. And I've now gone through the entire lineup twice. Just pull that thread through, make sure it doesn't get tangled on the way. Okay, and I've kept it, a little loosey-goosey just so that it looks nice and dangles nice. Now, I've got my thread coming out and I still have my tail. I'm going to go ahead and start tying this one off. Okay, here we go. So I've got my ear wire. I'm just going to take that and give it a little twist towards me. So I'm just turning my hand slightly. You can see it's angled now. And I really don't have a front or back here. If you feel like there's a side that just looks prettier, you can put it on that side. Frankly, it could all kind of twist on you, so it's not really critical. But you just loop that in between your 6 beads over the wire. Sorry, that little bead wants to fall down. And I just like it to be kind of 3 and 3, so I do check that. And then you grab your component and bring it back together. And you are all set. Isn't that a gorgeous pair of earrings?